A dangerous gang leader kidnaps the son of a wealthy man, but what happens when feelings start to blur the lines between captor and captive? What would you do if the life you knew was torn away in an instant? Would you fight for your freedom, or would you begin to question everything you've ever known? Can you ever truly escape the person who's holding you hostage, or will the lines between captor and captive blur forever? This isn't just a story about a ransom, it's about power, tension, and a love that shouldn't exist. The night is darker, the stakes higher, and the danger more real than ever. Joe's life has been turned upside down, and now he's facing a conflict unlike anything he could have imagined. Will he return to the life of wealth and security that he once knew? Or will the man who holds him captive change everything? In the grand hall of his estate, Joe's father, Ma, stood surrounded by his wealthiest allies. The room was opulent, its walls lined with gold-trimmed tapestries, and its floor polished to a mirror-like sheen. But despite the luxurious surroundings, the tension in the room was unmistakable. Mba paced back and forth, his mind heavy with the news of his son's kidnapping at the hands of the notorious Ode. Word had spread quickly, and his wealthiest allies gathered to discuss their next steps. "I will not bow to a thief," Ma declared sharply, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "Ode, whatever they call him, thinks he can humiliate me. He thinks he can take what's mine and get away with it. But I refuse to give him a single coin." His voice shook with a mix of anger and pride. What message does that send? That thieves can do whatever they want. That we, the wealthiest men in this kingdom, are weak. One of his allies, a rotund man with graying hair, raised a hand cautiously. His voice was measured. "But Mba," he began, "the authorities have been chasing Ode for years. The people love him. They hide him, protect him. How do you plan to succeed where they failed? And what of your son? Are you not concerned for his safety? He is your only heir." Mba's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with disdain. "He will not hurt my son. Joe is currency. I believe Ode isn't foolish enough to destroy something so valuable." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "And besides, I'm not counting on the people's loyalty. I've stationed men throughout the kingdom, people with no ties to Ode. Men who will do whatever it takes to bring my son back. I'll pay anyone else, but I will not give that rat a single coin." The ally pressed again, his tone incredulous. "So it's not even about the money. You'd rather pay strangers than pay the ransom and ensure your son's safety. It's about principle." Mba snapped. "This is about sending a message. Ode is a disease, a parasite on this kingdom. He pretends to help the poor, but all he does is sow chaos. If I give in to him, it only encourages more of his kind." The room fell into a tense silence, the murmurs of the allies subdued under the weight of Mba's conviction. But the graying man shook his head, his expression skeptical. "And yet," he said slowly, "the people would die before they give him up. Do you think your men can succeed where entire armies have failed?" Mba stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "They'll succeed," he said, his voice adamant. "Because they know what's at stake. I burned this kingdom down before I let Ode win." His allies exchanged uneasy glances, their doubts unspoken but evident. Yet Mba remained resolute, his hatred for Ode burning brighter than any concern for his son. Evening had settled over the poor district. The light faded into a soft dusky glow, and the streets, usually alive with the hum of trade and chatter, were quieter than usual. Ode and his gang remained hidden in their new hideout, their ears tuned to every sound beyond the thick walls. Joe sat near a small window, watching the flicker of torchlight in the distance. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something inevitable pressing down on them all. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but a growing unease, a realization that the world he thought he understood was far more complex than he ever imagined. "They're here," one of the gang members whispered, peeking through a crack in the door. Ode, seated at the table with a blade in his hand, didn't look up. His focus remained on the knife, the rhythmic motion of sharpening it steady and deliberate. "Let them come," Ode said calmly, his voice a quiet threat. "They won't find what they are looking for." Joe turned to him, frustration bubbling to the surface. How can you be so sure? He asked, his tone harsher than he planned. Ode glanced at him, his gaze hardening. Because this isn't the first time, he replied simply. And it won't be the last. The sounds of the raid grew louder outside, boots thudding against cobblestones, voices shouting orders. Joe leaned closer to the window, his heart pounding as he saw the guards moving through the streets, their torches lighting up doorways and alleys. But what struck him most was the reaction of the people. The poor district didn't scatter in fear or cower in silence. Instead, they moved with quiet purpose, some creating diversions to lead the guards astray, others standing firm and refusing to speak. A group of women began shouting at the guards, accusing them of harassing innocent people while the real criminals went free. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to push back or move on. "They're protecting you," Joe murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. "All these people, they're risking everything for you." Ode didn't respond immediately. He stood and moved to the window, his gaze fixed on the scene below. "They're not protecting me," he said quietly. "They're protecting themselves, their families, their way of life." Joe turned to him, his chest tightening with a mix of guilt and admiration. "But why?" he asked. "Why would they go this far for you?" Ode met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because I do what your father and his kind never will," he said. "I give them hope." The words hung in the air, quiet but powerful. Joe looked back at the street, his mind racing as he watched the people outwit the guards at every turn. For the first time, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mix of shame for the world he came from, and awe for the resilience of the one he was now seeing. The raid dragged on into the night, but the guards left empty-handed. As the last torch disappeared into the distance, a quiet cheer rippled through the district, carried by those who had stood their ground. Ode stepped away from the window, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "And that," he said, turning back to the room, "is why Mba will never win." Joe said nothing. His thoughts were too tangled to unravel. He sat back against the wall, his gaze lingering on Ode. He didn't understand the man, not fully, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave. The next day, Ade's patience began to wear thin. Mba's refusal to pay the ransom had stretched the situation too far, and Ode was growing increasingly frustrated. He paced the hideout, his sharp eyes flicking over to Joe every so often, who sat in the corner with his head bowed. "This needs to end," Ode muttered mostly to himself. He stopped in front of Joe, his gaze cold and focused. "Your father's games have gone on long enough. I think it's time I remind him exactly who I am." Joe looked up at him, confusion flooding his features. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Ode didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down to the table where his knife lay. He picked it up, inspecting the blade with careful precision, his fingers tracing the edge. Joe's heart rate quickened as he watched Ade's every movement. The air in the room grew denser, charged with silent tension. "Ode," Joe said, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you going to do?" Ode finally turned to Joe, his expression impassive. "I'm going to give your father a message he can't ignore," he sighed. "He wants proof that I'm serious. I'll show him." Joe's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced with the implications of Ade's words. His chest tightened as he realized what Ode was about to do. "No," Joe said urgently, his voice cracking. "You can't." But it was too late. Ode stepped closer to him, the knife gleaming ominously in his hand. "You don't understand," Ode said, his voice low and steady. "Mba won't take me seriously until he sees I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Joe's eyes widened in horror as he scrambled to his feet, backing away from Ode. "Please, no," he begged, his voice breaking. "Don't do this." Ode moved quickly, grabbing Joe's wrist before he could escape. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This is the only way to make Ma understand." Joe's heart raced, panic surging through him as Ode brought the knife closer to his hand. "I thought you," Joe's voice faltered. "I thought we. How could you do this?" His words reached Ode, and for a moment, Ade's hand faltered. He looked into Joe's eyes, his expression unreadable. For the briefest moment, there was a spark of hesitation. But it passed quickly, and Ode set his jaw, still in his resolve. Joe squeezed his eyes shut, his hands trembling as he tried to pull away. "Please," he whispered. The knife pressed against Joe's hand, and he flinched, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. The room fell into an eerie silence as he braced himself for the pain there. His mind was a blur. He had thought for a brief moment that Ode might actually care for him. How wrong he had been. Later that day, a messenger appeared at Mba's estate, breathless and pale, holding a small blood-stained parcel. The contents, carefully wrapped, were delivered into Mba's hands. He opened the box, and his eyes widened at the sight of the severed finger. The letter accompanying the finger was short, its message clear: *, your son's safety depends on your decision. Pay the ransom before it's too late, *. Mba's face drained of color as he stared at the gruesome token, the weight of the situation sinking in. His pride was shaken for the first time, his anger flaring, but so did a deep primal fear. He had to act. Mba's hand trembled as he picked up the finger, the magnitude of what was at stake finally hitting him. He turned to his men. "Prepare the ransom," he ordered, his eyes cold with fury. "I will not lose my son." The night was colder than usual as Ode prepared for the exchange. The quiet hum of the gang's activity filled the hideout, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Everything hinged on this moment: Joe's future, Aid's plans, and Mba's reluctant decision to meet the ransom demand. Joe sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. His mind was a whirl of confusion and emotion. He had spent the past few hours trying to make sense of everything. Part of him longed for the security of returning home, the life he had once known, but another part of him, the part he didn't fully understand, feared the empty, transactional world waiting for him. He wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. What troubled Joe even more was what had happened earlier that day, rather, what had almost happened. Just as Ode had been about to sever his hand, Joe had heard him curse under his breath, muttering, "I can't do this," before stepping back. Ode had seemed to carry a weight in that moment, something Joe couldn't place. When Joe had tried to speak, relieved that his hand was still intact, Ode had silenced him with a raised hand before turning away. Since then, Ode hadn't spoken a word to him, completely avoiding him. Joe had only learned of the deal with his father from what little he overheard. Ode wouldn't say a thing. Now, standing before the table preparing the ransom, Aid's movements were swift, mechanical, his hands moving as if unaffected by the gravity of the moment. But Joe could sense something beneath the surface. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. Ode wasn't as calm as he seemed. Joe stood up, his legs stiff from sitting too long, and his heart still racing from the lingering tension of earlier. He took a hesitant step toward Ode, his voice quieter than he intended. "Why did you stop earlier? Why didn't you go through with it?" Ode exhaled slowly but refused to meet Joe's eyes. "You're going back. You're going back to your father," he said, his tone flat. "That's all that matters." Joe's heart sank. He had no idea what he had expected Ode to say, but though he knew he should feel relief that his father had finally agreed to pay the ransom, that he would soon be returning home, the moment didn't feel like the relief he had imagined. There was something about Ode, something about this place, that made him hesitate. Ode finally turned to face Joe, but his gaze was cold. His eyes stripped of any warmth. "Get ready," he said, his voice final. "We don't have time to waste." Joe nodded, masking the hurt that settled deep inside him. Moments later, he followed Ode and his gang through the darkened alleys, each step taking him closer to the world he had once known, and farther away from the man who had completely changed his worldview. Stay tuned for part 4, where the tension reaches its peak, and all the secrets you've been waiting for will finally be revealed. Will Joe make the ultimate choice? Can Ode be trusted? You won't believe what happens next, ***. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Do well to turn on the notification bell so you're aware when next I'll be posting the next story. To all my subscribers, I love you, and to my returning subscribers, you're the best, and until next time. Bye bye.